Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to today's Comfort versus Control from the Parent's Perspective webinar. We are so pleased that you could join us. My name is Bonnie Zampino, and I'm the Engagement Specialist at Ukeru Systems. Before we get started, I'd like to go over a few housekeeping items so you know how best to participate in today's event. We have taken a screenshot of an example of the attendee interface. You should see something that looks like this on your own computer desktop in the upper right-hand corner. You're listening in using your computer speaker system by default. If you would prefer to join over the phone, just select telephone in the audio pane and the dial-in information will be displayed. We are eager for this to be as interactive as possible. You will have the opportunity to submit text questions to today's presenters by typing them into the questions pane of the control panel. You can send in your questions at any time during the presentation. We will collect those and address them during the Q&A session before we end today's presentation. In addition, we welcome you to join us throughout this conversation on Twitter by using the hashtag #StartsWithYou. A few other items we wanted to make you aware of. For those of you who need a certificate or continuing education credit for this discussion, we can make that available to you upon request. Continuing education credit is available through Shepherd University with an associated fee. In addition, a copy of this presentation will be distributed in the next few days. We are also recording this conversation and we'll post that on our website later this week. So to begin the conversation, I'd like to turn things over to Ukeru's President, Kim Sanders.
Thanks, Bonnie. So we're super excited to have this conversation today. We have with us two parents whom Ukeru has gotten to know really well over the past few months. Both are incredible advocates for their children and understand the benefits of a restraint-free approach. Unfortunately, they also are very aware of the downside of both restrictive and coercive techniques. So let's just get started. Sean Campbell will likely always be best known as Alex's dad. His 10-year-old son has become a bit famous talking about and even writing about his experiences with restraint and seclusion. So we welcome you, Sean.
All right, thank you, Kim.
Yeah, so glad to have you. Also with us is Rhonda Richardson, who in addition to being mom to Matthew, who is 24, she runs a very popular Facebook page at Autism Chronicles. We hope that after the webinar, you're able to check out her Facebook page.
Thank you.
Before we begin, let's talk a little bit about the definition of comfort versus control. So this is a term that in Ukeru we take extremely seriously, and at our parent organization, Grafton Integrated Health Network, we're actually using every day in the individuals that we're working with in their treatment. Ideally, we'd like to go to the next slide, that'd be great. The definition of comfort versus control really in a nutshell is the statement we have here. People inherently want to do well, and those with disabilities are no exception. When we see an individual with a disability struggling, we see it as our responsibility to find out the why and to teach the skills necessary for success. It goes back to the golden rule of we want to make sure that we're treating other people the way we'd like to be treated, and that again we're very serious about making sure that we're becoming the behavior detectives for people, that that weight or that responsibility truly should be on our shoulders to help them when they're struggling and to figure out why. Some of the other basics for comfort versus control is we want to make sure we have a supportive caregiving environment. We want to be sensitive to the individual's past experiences, which could include violence or victimization. And we want to make sure that we are using the least restrictive environment that's going to produce the best outcomes. So let's get started. Sean, why don't you start by talking a little bit about Alex for us?
Okay, thank you, Kim. And I just want to thank everybody for taking your time out of your busy schedules and joining us on this webinar today. My name is Sean Campbell, and as Kim mentioned earlier, I am Alex's dad. I'm also the chauffeur and really just the guy who can get him from place to place these days. He just tells me when and where I need to be, and he does all the talking. The next slide, please. As a child, Alex was a very happy child. He was my first son, so really I didn't have a comparison point, and I was never really concerned when, he never spoke his first 2 years. He never pointed, he never brought us things that were of interest, and, was just happy-go-lucky child. It wasn't until he was 3 that a diagnosis of autism came later. Next slide. And so what happened was that for the first couple of years is that we actually thought that he was hearing impaired. So we had his hearing tested several times and found out each time that his hearing was fine. And so we started teaching him sign language. Next slide. When he was 2, he was given the label of developmental delay. As I said, he was diagnosed later when he was 3 with autism, but for the first couple of years, we had this developmental delay tag. And then all of a sudden, as soon as he started school, he qualified for the preschool program at the local public school. He began speaking in complete sentences. He literally went from nothing, and then one day woke up and was speaking complete sentences, asking about things like pneumatic hinges and automatically opening and closing doors. It was just quite an interesting experience for my wife and I. Next slide, please. Things started to change, though, in kindergarten. As I said here, in the last 43 days of kindergarten, 35 of those days were spent either in an out-of-school suspension or some type of in-school suspension. Really, he started getting referrals because his teachers had given up on him, in my opinion. He really had this intense interest in doors and locks, and he was not a physically aggressive child, but he was verbally aggressive. And he didn't understand that he was a child in a classroom setting and that the teacher was the boss. He really saw himself as a 50-year-old man, and when he would ask questions and got answers that didn't make sense, he would challenge authority. And what we noticed was that his case manager at this time, she started locking him out of the classroom because she got tired of dealing with him. And so she thought that it would be a better place for him to be put out in the hallway. When we went to the special ed director and voiced our concerns about this, she, in an IEP meeting, said, "Your son is destined to go to jail. You might as well get used to that now." Next slide, please. Well, things didn't get better. In fact, they got worse. And in first grade, he received 25 suspensions the first 40 days in first grade. He had a new case manager, and the new case manager started locking him inside the classroom. She would move all of her students out and lock him in the classroom and then would walk away and leave him in there. When we were trying to find out ways that we could help him understand social cues and try to understand the world around him better, so we went to Community Services Board seeking help and understanding, but we were told that he was destined to go to jail. That's the best advice that they gave us, was to just understand that he's probably not going to be, living in the home but so much longer. And in fact, he was kicked out of public school after the first 9 weeks that he was there. Next slide, please. The school system put him in a outside placement, and the principal of that outside placement started using seclusion as a form of discipline. For example, if Alex were to tear paper or to run around the classroom, he would get anywhere from 1 to 3 hours put into a converted storage closet. The converted storage closet had a concrete floor, had a wire mesh over the window, And so the principal of this school would literally drag him across the school, put him into this converted storage closet. He would then move a teacher desk in front to prevent him from opening the door. And then sometimes he would tape up aluminum foil on the observation window. And as I said, he would be in there anywhere from 1 to 3 hours. The thing that really upset my wife and I more than anything is that we were never informed. We never knew about any of this going on. Instead, at home, we saw this second grader who literally just started melting, and who just really began hating everything, hating life, hating us, hating school, everything. Next slide, please. So when this came to our attention and we found out what was going on, we went to the Department of Ed, and the Department of Education then started pressuring the principal to not use seclusion. As a consequence, he was kicked out of the school, and he was placed into another setting, in which the teachers there started using restraints inappropriately. For example, one of the restraints that they used consisted of grabbing him by his throat and slamming him on the ground repeatedly. We had to pay a visit to the hospital for that. And we reached a point where we didn't know what could be done. Next slide, please. Said as a family, we saw things that were just really being thrown out of whack at home. We also noticed that Alex would start secluding his younger brother, who was 3 years younger. We would find him holding him inside of a closet, holding the door shut, and when we would ask him questions, why are you doing this? And he said, well, this is what you do to bad children. This is what's been done to me. We also noticed that Alex had this intense mistrust of adults, and he would flinch, and he would shy away from adults. And he really, really had a strong, intensive fear of being in a room, especially a room with a closed door, and especially in a room that was dark. One of the things we also noticed is that Alex hated going to sleep at night because he knew that he would have to wake up the next morning and go to school. And with all these things coming together, we were very concerned. The school system at this point really was trying to pressure us into institutionalizing him. They wanted him to go to not another outside placement, but they wanted him to go to a place permanently where he would be permanently outside of our home and where he could get what they deemed good care taken to him. And, so he could have good care and not disrupt our family or alleviate the school of any further responsibility. And it became a real challenge with us because we were kind of at a loss. We didn't know what to do. Next slide, please. So what happened, you say? Well, we learned that in Virginia, the things that were going on with him using seclusion as means of discipline, injuring children, at the time, there were no regulations. There were no laws, no regulations in the state of Virginia, and there are no regulations and laws on a national scale, federal law, that prevent this from occurring. So, next slide, please. So I reached out and I started looking for the right people. Well, the Disability Law Center really helped us to put this idea of locking a child away at an institution to rest. They reminded very gently, but very firmly, they reminded the school system of their obligation of something called FAPE. All of the suspensions, all of the removal from classroom, they got dinged pretty heavily for denial of FAPE and also for improperly disciplining a child with disabilities. The ARC, on the other hand, helped us to connect with other families to find out that our story was not unique. And our story, we were not alone. So the old adage, misery loves company. Well, we found that there were other parents out there who were in very similar situations as ours. And so there was a better feeling to know that we weren't alone. And also the ARC helped us introduce us to different legislative bodies like the Commission on Youth. Next slide, please. So one of the first things that we had Alex do, actually, his psychologist actually asked Alex to do this, was to create a story to talk about his feelings of what it felt like when he was being secluded. And Alex created a book. He wrote this book when he was 7, and he in turn shared this book with anybody and everybody who would read it. This included senators, delegates, any type of person in power, legislator, anybody who would be willing to read this book. And from this book, he was able to inspire 2 bills in the state of Virginia. One happened to do with one bill became a law, which happened to do with due process, and the other bill was actually focused on the beginnings of looking into the use of restraint and seclusion in Virginia. Go ahead and advance, please. One more time. So, back one. There we go. So here's a picture of Alex at 9 years old. He is addressing the Commission on Youth, and he has not only shared with them his story, written story, but he decided that he needed to address the panel himself, by himself. What you all can't see is behind him, there are about 200 people. That room had standing room only. And so he's talking to a group of senators and delegates about the need to make change and the need to protect kids like him from being hurt and injured. And from his testimony, he was able to generate 2 more bills. And those 2 bills then resulted into another law, which is now mandating the Virginia Department of Education to create regulations regarding the use of restraint, seclusion, in public schools. Next slide, please. In addition to testifying to the Commission on Youth, here's a picture. This is Alex testifying to the House Subcommittee on Education. He was also asked to testify to the House Subcommittee, or to the Senate Subcommittee on Education, as well as the full Committee on Education. He has also served as a panelist for using what they call CSA funds, or Children's Services Act funds, for children in outside placements. And he was also assigned to the Restraint and Seclusion Stakeholders Group through VDOE, and he was assigned as asked to serve as a panelist for promoting self-advocacy by the Council for Exceptional Children. Next slide, please. And with his advocacy work, he made it on the front cover of a magazine. In the bottom left, he has a note written to him by the governor of Virginia. He was featured on channel 6, 8, channel 12, channel 23, Fox. He made the Associated Press, and he was really promoting this need for change in terms of using restraint and seclusion. Next slide, please. And so people say, how is he doing today? Well, today he's in a public school, and today he has in all advanced classes, and he's doing quite well. Next slide, please. He went to DC, and he met with Tim Kaine and Mark Warner, as well as some congressmen, Congressman Whitman, Bratt, Forbes, Beyer, Comstock. So he, as I said, when I'm his chauffeur, he tells me when and where his appointments are, and I just kind of take him there. Next slide, please. And he also testified recently to the Virginia Department of Education, and he also spoke in front of a rally in front of 300 people at the Capitol here in Richmond, encouraging them to use their voices and to make positive change. Next slide. And these are just some of what Alex said. He asked me to include a photograph of his favorite people. So here are various senators, this lieutenant governor in the bottom center. And so he has become quite the little activist and advocate. Next slide. And picked up some awards on the way. Next slide. And so the lesson, I guess, really I want, if there's one thing that I would like to reiterate to you all is that finding like-minded people is the key. And that when we think about children like my son, who were literally locked away in scream rooms or whatever you want to call them, or they're being hurt, there's a wealth of talent and a wealth of gifts that they have to offer. And I think sometimes when we think about spending the time to find out what the antecedents are to those behaviors, it's well worth finding those antecedents, because you never know what you're going to uncover in each child. And I had to include this picture of that's his teacher, and that's his last teacher who actually encouraged him to become an advocate, and she's the one who saw the good in him. And as I said, today, he's just flying high. So back to you, Kim. And for those of you who have any questions, I'll certainly answer them after we finish up.
Thank you so much, Sean. And I can say that those of us here in the Ukeru office, we have the privilege of knowing Alex, and he is an incredible kid, and so fortunate to have such a good chauffeur. So thank you for that. So just want to make sure that folks know that if you have questions, please type those in on your computer or there, laptop, whatever you're using, and as soon as we're finished, we'll start answering some questions. But for right now, Rhonda, why don't you share some stories about Matthew with us?
Thank you, Kim, and thank you all for joining the webinar today. Appreciate this opportunity. Next slide. So my name is Rhonda Richardson. I'm the mother of Matthew Parcell, and just wanted to kind of share with you our first slide, which is tied to hopes and dreams. As with all parents, Matthew's dad and I were thrilled beyond words when we realized that I was pregnant. This was especially exciting for us as I had suffered through 2 previous miscarriages. We planned, we prepared, and we celebrated the impending birth of our son. We dreamed of all of the amazing things that he would experience, both secretly hoping he'd be a rock star athlete, as both his dad and I were excelled at sports and enjoyed sports. We also decided, though, that we'd support him with whatever he wanted to do. Matthew was born in 1993, 4 weeks early, with numerous medical issues. Immediately, he was taken to the NICU, where he remained for 2 weeks. Each day he was there, new discoveries were made regarding his medical conditions, and for the next 4 years, our focus became ensuring that Matthew received the medical care that he needed. At 9 months old, we were referred by his pediatrician to our local parent infant education PI program, as Matthew was experiencing significant delays. For the next year, he participated in ongoing therapy with minimal progress, but he was making progress. He was also, like Alex, given the label developmentally delayed, I should say. Matthew entered a special preschool at the age of 2. Next slide. Between the ages of 4 and 5, Matthew started exhibiting aggressive behaviors both in the classroom and at our home, and what became a vicious cycle of behaviors worsened over time. His behaviors included those that are listed above in the slide. He was hitting, kicking, biting, pinching, throwing objects, destroying property, and then some. The stress in our family soared, and it resulted in my husband and I divorcing due to our differences of opinions on what was happening and how best to deal with the behaviors and the ongoing medical needs, how they should be handled. Then I found myself a single mother with no father involvement, caring for a child with severe physical and mental disabilities, and I had no other choice but to kind of carry it forward. What I would later learn is that my attempts to do the best that I could to keep him calm, I was actually increasing his need for attention and thereby increasing a lot of the behaviors, but I would learn years later that the behaviors are often associated with autism. And at the time, I didn't know he had autism yet. So they weren't the result of what I was as a parent doing. Meanwhile, his medical conditions continued to accumulate. So the impact of the disruptive behavior, it definitely interfered with our interventions that we were trying to use on Matthew, and it impacted his ability to perform in school. He was participating on a little baseball league team, and we had to discontinue that when his behaviors became too aggressive. And what this did was it resulted in our isolation as a family, because we were no longer able to really go out and participate in activities. So our quality of life changed. Next slide. So I thought I'd just take a second to kind of stop here and provide a clear definition of seclusion and the restraints, as everything that you see in this slide is what we experienced moving forward through the years. Seclusion is the involuntary or solitary confinement of an individual, while restraint is any method, physical or mechanical device or material or equipment that immobilizes or reduces an individual's ability to freely move his arms, legs, body, or head. And the use of medication is also considered a form of restraint. While I know that seclusion and restraints traumatized Matthew, I can tell you firsthand it also traumatized our family as we lived through this. Next slide. So what research shows is that seclusion and restraint can result in psychological harm and physical injuries and death for people subjected to and staff applying techniques. People who experience seclusion and restraint remain in care longer. And what you see in this photo is an actual picture of my arm at a point in our life when Matthew was really into pinching. And so my entire body looked like this, but this just kind of gives you an idea of what we were going through at the time. Next slide. So I list up here some other areas where we had our personal experience regarding seclusion and restraint. And the first bullet that you see there is actually St. Elizabeth's Psychiatric Hospital. And this actually does not involve Matthew. It involves me. And if you'll just take a minute to kind of envision this, it's 1985, way before Matthew was born, obviously. I'm fresh out of college. I'm gainfully employed with my first job. It's with the federal government. And I'm working in a psych hospital where the use of seclusion rooms, shackles, straitjackets, and medications were used all day, every day by staff to manage and admittedly sometimes to protect the patients. For someone so young and with no real experience, this kind of normalized the use of seclusion and restraints for me. I didn't know any differently. So going into the situations that we faced with Matthew, I was now confused as to how best to handle the behaviors. In December of 1998, Matthew was about 5 years old, 9 months, and in elementary school, we sought professional help everywhere. We were going to different hospitals. We were at every single hospital, and then in our region, we were seeing all kinds of therapists. We were trying to get a hold on the behaviors. And what ended up happening was we were using a lot of medications, psychotropic medications, because that was the norm at the time. Each one of the medications that we tried either resulted in a spike in behaviors or physical side effects that could not be ignored. We were eventually referred to Children's Hospital, where Matthew was placed on a children's psychiatric unit. And while there, we observed the use of seclusion and restraints being used and felt strongly that that would never work to address the issues Matthew faced. After almost 2 weeks, staff came to the same realization and referred us to Kennedy Krieger Institute. In January of 1999, Matthew underwent a functional analysis by Kennedy Krieger, and this was the first time, just shy of 6 years old, that Matthew was formally diagnosed with autism. You know, back then on TV, you would see the images of what autistic individuals, and all that they showed at that time were just people sitting there rocking back and forth. That was all I knew about autism, so it had never crossed my mind. And prior to that, no doctors or anybody had mentioned autism. As a result of the assessment, he was deemed appropriate for their outpatient services, and as the months went on, it became clear his behaviors required more intensive services, and so he was admitted to their neurobehavior unit in December. Assessments were performed while he was there to determine what kinds of things would be used as rewards for Matthew, and a plan for his treatment to address the behaviors was developed. Kennedy Krieger employed the use of several strategies to determine the best method for tackling his behaviors. Basket holds, the use of basket holds, seclusions, timeouts, being pushed against the wall were all tried, but the one and the only thing that showed any improvement was the removal of attention for behaviors. It wasn't restraints and it wasn't seclusion, it was the removal of attention. And so Kennedy Krieger used pads and protective armwear, and because of that, it made it possible for me and the staff to remain with Matthew, not to isolate him in a seclusion room, and to actually employ the treatment as we needed to in the midst of the worst behaviors. And we were protected and there was no need to restrain him. He was also slowly weaned off all medications as we went through his hospitalization. When he went into Kennedy Krieger, he was on about 8 medications a day. After about 3 months of daily treatment, he was discharged in March of 2000 on no medication. And what we used was a card system that was our behavioral intervention. Our staff in the school, all of our family members were trained on this method, and it worked. So like I said, he was discharged in 2000 and he was doing great. Things were wonderful. And then about 2005, things changed as puberty set in. By this time, Matthew was now in middle school. Next slide. By Matthew's second year in middle school, which was the 7th grade here, behaviors began to once again disrupt his abilities to succeed in the classroom, and he was having more difficulty at home. He was occasionally removed from his class and sent either to the principal's office or I was requested to pick him up. For a child like Matthew, being sent to the principal's office, if they were thinking that it was going to be some kind of disciplinary thing, it meant nothing because he didn't even know what a principal was. By the end of the 8th grade, the pattern of being suspended from school had begun. Entering high school, Matthew was placed in a moderately cognitive impairment classroom setting, something that turned out to be the absolute worst setting for him. He was in a classroom with kids that were of all types of skill levels, and some that could do math, some that, were reading. Matthew could hardly speak, He was constantly sent home for his behaviors because Matthew did not move easily from his classroom, and when he experienced his meltdowns, the other kids were removed from the classroom. While good for the other kids, this had to be traumatizing to Matthew in the time to be left alone, sometimes with the building police officer awaiting my arrival. Within Matthew's first month, he had been suspended and or sent home from school 11 days. This continued for 3 months before I finally refused to send him back until a more appropriate placement could be found. Not long after this, Matthew was moved to an alternative placement. This placement turned out to be quite successful for the duration of the school year. But a few months into the year 2, things started to go south. Rather than have it get to the point of no return, I placed Matthew on Kennedy Krieger's waiting list again. He was older now, so I had to wait. He was approved for their services, but the wait list was quite long. I opened up Matthew's CSB case again from when he was a young infant in hopes of getting help, any help that I could, while I waited for the Kennedy Krieger admission, but the admission never happened. Community Services Board provided an in-home behavioral analyst, and I was able to get I forget the name of it, one of the waivers where I could get in-home help. What happened with that is I would get in-home help and it would last one day and then they would never return because of Matthew's behaviors. The behavior analyst that they brought into the home believed in and actively implemented techniques of timeout with restraints, and oftentimes that resulted in physically dragging him upstairs to a room that we had identified as a timeout location when he would not go there willingly. I was terrified. Matthew has all these medical issues, and being drug anywhere, I was terrified. He's got 2 18-inch rods in his back, that they would somehow become loosened and we would have all kinds of medical issues. I should also tell you that Matthew is now 6'4". So trying to deal with these behaviors now, it's very different. When he was at Kennedy Krieger the first round and he was about 5 feet, he was now 6'4". And again, I'm relying on a professional to help me with the situation. And so while I did not 100% believe with what this behavior analyst was doing, I was supporting it because I was desperate. I remember Matthew's dad came to the home to pick him up, and I wanted him to kind of watch and to learn what this behavior analyst was using. He was so distraught with what he saw, he took Matthew in the middle of the therapy session and left. It wasn't long after that the behavior therapist stopped coming, and I never found out why, but I never received a call or nothing. So then we were literally left with nothing. Meanwhile, though, we had opened up our CSB case. So I was still a little hopeful. Next slide, please. What you see here is that while the behavior analyst was still working with us in the home, Matthews was still in his alternative placement. And at one point, I would I was able to get copies of some of the records that they were keeping on Matthew. And so what you see here is a progressive use of seclusion and restraints. And I guess I draw your attention to it. You see it starts the school year, September, and I'll draw your attention to February 23rd. He was put into, they called a classroom, timeout room. It was really a seclusion room, a padded seclusion room. From 9 to 9:26, he was put back in there at 9:55 to 11 o'clock, and he was then taken by a two-person escort, which was restraints, to another room to be secluded. Again, at 12:44 to 12:50, he was put back in the classroom seclusion room. If you go to the lower half of the next page, side of the page, you'll see that he went, go back. You'll see that he went back in at 12:58 all the way to 2:40. That was all in one day. So we were definitely having progressive issues with the seclusion. At times, like I said, he was restrained and taken by staff to another location that they called a reality orientation room, which to me is a fancy way of saying seclusion. At some point, the behavior analyst failed to show up, like I said, and so we were then left with nothing. Because our case was so severe, Matthew was eventually able to receive a Medicaid waiver slot, and we were faced with the reality that this was beyond what I could provide him. I'll be honest, horrible thoughts crossed my mind as I struggled to deal with it, placing him and relying upon others to do what I could not do. I felt like I had failed him when, in fact, I made the best decision I could have ever made for him when I selected Grafton. Sorry. Next slide. And so what you see in this slide is my idea of a first place from my son. It's a first place method for using my son, and it was found at Grafton. And so while barely in any right mind to make any kind of decisions, I made the decision that I felt was best for Matthew and for our family if we were going to have any chance. The thing that stood out most to me of all regarding the selection of this placement was their hands-off philosophy. It made all the difference in the world, and to this day, it makes all the difference in the world. Next slide. So what you see here are different strategies that we've learned since Matthew's been at Grafton, and he went to Grafton in July 29th, I'll never forget the day, 2010. But these were calming strategies and redirection activities that Matthew likes. So what they did was they built upon the things that Matthew likes. And so those are things like music, his friends, water, animals, straying, exercise, family, and swings. Grafton determined that redirection worked best for him, and we started building upon those activities that he enjoyed or conversations and topics that he loves to perseverate on. And we employ them whenever we can, whenever his behaviors become problematic. Grafton also uses pads to separate individuals versus restraining them, which is another wonderful technique. Matthew has thrived in this environment. It's not, and nor will it ever be perfect, but for Matthew, it absolutely works. Our family is more reunified than ever because Matthew's behaviors are now manageable. I hope I don't jinx this. I'm now able to bring Matthew home every other weekend, sometimes more, and we function as a family, participating in almost everything we'd like to. I still fear, I'll be honest, when we're out in the community, I get worried that he might have a meltdown or strike out at somebody, but I know that given the strategies that he's learned and what I know to do now, that we can turn it around without seclusion and without restraints and without timeout. I'd like to share with you now some of the accomplishments that Matthew has achieved over the past 7 years while at Grafton. Next slide. Music and movies. Like I said, what we did was we found the things that Matthew likes, and so we now have a music therapist that comes into Matthew's group home twice a month and provides individual music therapy sessions with Matthew. And the picture to the right shows you I was able to take him on a recent trip to Florida. It was just Matthew and Mommy driving to Florida, and you can see, things that are important to him. So I had his string and I had his Barney and his movies. Next slide, please. Matthew's very thin, as you can see, and so exercise is not only a good strategy, but it's also good for his health. So in our neighborhood, we have lots of trails. So when I bring him home, I try to get out, and when we need to redirect his behaviors, we go for a walk. He loves our dogs, and so we use him to help walk the dogs. We walk the trails, and I'll take him to the zoo, and we just walk around and look at the animals. Next slide, please. As we all know, water, a lot of kids with autism love water, and so I've used that to my advantage. We've taken him out on boats. Like I said, the other photos on the bottom right, side right or whatever, we're taking it on our trip to Florida. So you can see him chilling in the hot tub and walking the beach and then floating out into the ocean. Next slide, please. This is a picture of Matthew at his group home, and if you can see, it's a little hard to see, but I was able to purchase 2 rocking chairs, and so he's able to, when he gets a little overwhelmed, or maybe the staff feels something's coming on, they're able to redirect him and send him out on good weather days out to the front porch, where he enjoys just looking around the neighborhood. Another one of his favorite activities is just going to parks and swinging. He would swing all day if I could let him. And you'll see almost in every one of these pictures, he has string with him. Next slide, please. Accomplishments for Matthew include things that I never thought would happen, and that was, first off, graduating from school. So he graduated from Grafton. The picture to the right of that with the little flower, he also attended prom, which is pretty awesome for me to see actually happen. Another photo is, we enjoy a lot of quality time in our car driving between my home and out to Grafton. And oftentimes I'll pull over to the side of the road if I feel like he's getting ready to have a trouble, and we'll just kind of get out and look around. And so I've been able to take him to outdoor parks and animal parks. If you look down to the bottom of the slide, I've actually taken him to the Nationals game, which I could have never done before. But I know how to now kind of redirect him again. You see family photos beside that. We could have never enjoyed a family photo because a family activity, because he would be spitting in everybody's food and or trying to steal it. He still tries to steal food sometimes. He's a big eater. Next slide. And so lastly, as Kim mentioned, I have an Autism Chronicles blog page that is on Facebook. You're welcome to follow our story if you wish. I try to share activities or stories that deal with Matthew, but also just autism in general. So thank you for listening to my story. And at this time, I'll turn it back over to you, Kim, as I know we're getting ready for the Q&A portion of the presentation.
Rhonda, thank you so much. True, I feel like I know a lot of that story, of course, because Matthew's here, but also because I'm one of your big followers on your Autism Chronicles Facebook. And again, I encourage people to go to that. It's very inspirational and just keeps everything in perspective for everyone. So I really encourage folks to do that. I would say also, Rhonda, that again, like I just mentioned to Sean, both Alex and Matthew are so lucky to have you all as parents and advocates. And I wish that we could say that all of the folks that we're serving at Grafton have that kind of support. Unfortunately, they don't. But we have a lot of amazing families here. But again, it makes our job easier when we feel like we can be a team with a family. So thank you, Rhonda.
Thank you. Thank you.
So questions. Please, if anyone has a question, type it in. We do have a question. How about if for each of you, if you had to give one piece of advice to a parent or a teacher, or a professional who's listening today, what would that one piece of advice be? Sean, do you want to start us?
Sure. I guess the biggest piece of advice I would say is just patience and perseverance. Don't give up. Just keep, use all your resources and just don't give up. Anything is possible with enough time and patience.
I would agree with Sean. Patience is very important. And I think for Matthew, my sense is that he's probably far less verbal than Alex, but please don't assume Matthew doesn't know what's going on just because he might not be able to articulate how he's feeling or the impact to what he's seeing. I know that when I bring him home, I hear things that he's repeating. You know, we've got the perseveration, the echolalia. So I know he's hearing and he's seeing everything. So don't assume he doesn't know what's going on. And in his own way, he can communicate to me. And like I said, I mean, like Sean said, is they all have their strengths and they all have their abilities and they are all unique and special. And they mean the world to us. And in my case, I'm trusting everybody with my son, which is a huge, it's a huge compliment to you that I do value your services and I want you to know that I appreciate them.
Thank you. Rhonda, so I'm just going to directly read a question that came in for you.
Okay.
How do you accomplish self-care for yourself? This person is an in-home clinician and would like to know how to better address the needs of the client's parents as they correspond with the client's treatment. So how do you take care of yourself?
Well, you know, gosh, I didn't, honestly. I really didn't. I compartmentalized. And for me, work was my respite. So coming to work was my way of getting away and kind of re-energizing. Prior to all of this happening, I was a recreation therapist. That was my degree in school. And so I was trained to deal with people with disabilities, and it became too close. So what I realized, one way of preserving my own sanity was I realized I had to make a career change, because I could not do it all day and I could not do it all night. And so I did that. I went and I took classes online and I learned how to do different things so that I was able to walk away from the job that I was trained to do and enter a whole new field. As far as respite, again, I was a single mom, so I was able to use the ARC respite services. But again, you know, it's a scary thing, but it's something you have to do, is to rely on other people. And so, as Sean said, you've got to find the right people. And I was able to find caregivers that I could leave Matthew with for a couple hours or the night. And ARC offered respite care, you know, parents' night out is what they called it. And so when I tried to take advantage of it and just go out to dinner while Matthew was being cared for a few hours. But the main thing that I did, and most people won't find it taking care of myself, was I went to work.
Mm-hmm. Right.
I did seek a therapist, you know, at one time, and they were kind of able to help me through it a little bit, but you know, I didn't have time to think about me.
Right. Sean, how about for you? How do you take care of yourself, or used to, especially, you know, during the most trying times?
I have to agree. I mean, when Rhonda talked about the EDCD waiver and you know, you would have somebody who would come in and provide respite for a day, and then the next day they wouldn't show. I can't tell you how many people we had that happen with, and they would come in, they would see this small, you know, kindergartner and say, oh, he's cute and everything, and then as soon as he started questioning and challenging them, next day gone. And so really, I think the thing that helped us get through was learning that you have to find people to help you. We tried to tackle it by ourselves. You know, my wife and I are both educators, and so we thought that, we could handle this by ourselves. We know, and we were wrong. Boy, were we wrong. And part of it is also learning to pick and choose your battles. You know, as my wife says, she teaches in the inner city now, and she said, you know, it's there were things that used to bother her, but today, after our experiences, it's like, you know, it's don't lose, you know, don't sweat over the little things. You know, you pick and choose your battles, and that was a hard lesson for us to learn, to say, you know what, in the end, is everybody going to be okay? Yeah, okay. Then, you know, you just have to take that big breath and, I said, take a step back and just be patient.
Right. Well, you know, I have to tell you guys that we're getting more statements coming through than questions. So we're getting some statements of people expressing their gratitude towards you both for paving the way for others. And well, paving the way not only for other parents, but for other children that may be, you know, just starting out with their school experience. So I think that's a big accomplishment, and it says a whole lot about the both of you. So again, we thank you.
Thank you. I will add with regard to the schools, if they're just at the early stages of school, document everything. Even if everything's going well right now, just document.
Are there any other key resources? Any other key resources that you would point people to? I know in your presentation, you know, for instance, Sean, you mentioned a couple resources that were helpful, but others that you would point parents to?
I honestly think the ARC and local societies, like if there's a particular disability, local societies also have our wealth of resources. Typically, what I learned to do as a parent is I read everything I could read. I'd read everything about autism. I read everything about school law. I mean, I've gotten to the point now where, you know, I follow just about everything I can follow just to keep on top of it. And it's hard. It's a hard thing to do when parents are stretched anyway. But I highly recommend one of the best resources is going out and to, you know, like the Department of Ed's website, and just really not only reading the rights, but, you know, parents' rights, but actually getting to know those rights very, very well. So that way, when you walk into meetings, you know what are my child's rights, and letting your child know these are your rights. So there's no confusion.
Right. And I would add that in our situation, at one point, I had to hire special needs education advocates, and I used them, and that was a very valuable resource to me.
Terrific. Well, it looks like we're getting close to our ending time, so just to be mindful of everyone's busy schedules, I think we'll conclude, and I just, again, would like to thank Rhonda and Sean for joining us, and I'm very hopeful that we can do a whole lot more together. I would also ask folks to make sure to stay in touch with Ukeru Systems. You can follow us on Facebook too, as well as Twitter. And we often use the hashtag, It Starts With You. And we hope that you join us for some more webinars. Now, please remember that we've recorded this and we'll have this on our website. If you have others that you'd like to share it with, please do. It normally takes us about 48 hours to get that up. And if anyone would care to have a certificate of attendance, we're going to try to get those out a lot quicker than we've done in the past. If you'd like to email us, that would be great. And we'll also have information on our website about the CEUs. So just let us know what you need. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you all.